Dear friends, it's my honor and privilege to chair this plenary session with the head of the opposition, Mrs. Tzipi Livni, as our guest. The legitimacy of Jewish state is discussed these days not only by our enemies, but also sometimes by friends and members of our community. This phenomenon makes this conference even more important and actual than before. Jewish People Policy Institute has enough courage to face major conflicts and disputes within Jewish and Israeli society. This institute has a mission to think independently and prepare strategic recommendations for decision makers. I am also very proud of you for taking part in this important initiative. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce the head of the opposition, Mrs. Tzipi Livni. Mrs. Tzipi Livni is rightly regarded as one of the most influenced leaders of our people. Mrs. Livni was born and raised in a home in which Eretz Israel meant a lot. Shnei tzdadim le'Yarden, zu shelanu, zu gam ken. Which means there are two banks of the Jordan River, this is ours and that is ours too. But her involvement in policy making and diplomacy as foreign minister and acting prime minister raised the dilemma, either a greater state or a Jewish state. And this, as well as the future of Jerusalem and the Jewish holy sites, is one of the most important issues discussed at our conference. We are eagerly anticipating to hear her analysis of the current state of the peace process and the role of the Jewish diaspora. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Tzipi Livni.
Thank you, and welcome to Israel. I just came few days ago from a visit to the States and Canada in order to open a new dialogue between Israel and the Jews in diaspora, because I believe that we need a new dialogue. I think that the obvious of 1948 is not obvious anymore. I think that there are some questions among young people in Israel and in the Jewish communities about Israel. I think that some of them, especially when it comes to young people abroad, they don't feel the same pride of Israel as their parents. And I know that these are times in which it's not easy to defend or to stand for the state of Israel, to advocate for Israel. And I believe that the gap between Israel or the image of Israel and between what Israel really is in terms of values is something that needs to be bridged. But we cannot just speak about the threats that we all face. Oh, well, I'm going to relate to this as well, but it's not enough. We need also to decide what is the common denominator between Israel and the Jews in diaspora. How can we work together in order not just to change the image of Israel, but to make Israel a better place to live in and to enhance the ties between Israel and the Jews in diaspora. So I see myself as a Jew and Israeli, that order, or maybe a Jew, an Israeli, a Jewish mother. And it's not just for a joke, but because the reason for me to be in politics, and I hate politics, is because it was also serious, it was not joking. It's because I want to know what we leave to our children here. And Israel is maybe the only place in the world in which when you are thinking about your children is not just who's going to be my next daughter-in-law, what the children are going to do, but what is the state that we leave to our children. Is it going to be a secured place to live in? What's going to be the values of these states? And this is the reason for me to be in politics and to try to change also some of the realities. Since I believe that we shouldn't define ourselves in accordance to the nature of the threats that we have, because in doing so we give our enemies the possibility to define us. And I believe that we should speak about the substance of what does it mean to be a Jewish and democratic state, and what does it tell us about the relations between Israel and the Jews in diaspora. But yet we need to we cannot undermine the nature of the threat that we face altogether, Israel and the world Jewry. Starting with anti-Semitism that rises its ugly head in different parts of the world. Extremism, extreme Islamic, not only movement, but a state like Iran that expresses this agenda of hatred, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, plus Hamas in the Palestinian Authority, all together represent extreme religious ideology that cannot accept the right of Israel to exist. And unfortunately, religious conflicts are unsolvable. And they exploit the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to get more support from radical elements, even though we need to understand that this ideology is not the outcome of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Just imagine that we solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict tomorrow morning, Iran is not going to change its ideology. But they abuse the conflict in order to get support and to destabilize the region. And of course, we have this process of delegitimization of the State of Israel as homeland for the Jewish people. It was a process that was, until a few years ago, underneath the surface, and now it's there. It's there. It relates to some question marks that we could hear, especially in Europe at first, that now we can hear this all over, whether Judaism is a religion or nationality. Some regrets that I could hear in Europe, saying something like, okay, because of the Holocaust, we gave the Jews a state, and now the Palestinians are suffering because of our regrets. And this is something that we need to address in an understanding that the State of Israel was not created because of the Holocaust, but the State of Israel was created as part of the relations between the Jewish people to the land of Israel, and this is part of, or the basic of the Zionism as ideology, as part of the idea of having the people coming back to the homeland of our forefathers and creating a state that was accepted by the international community in 1947 in accordance to the idea of two states, one a Jewish state and the other is an Arab state. Now we need to relate, or we cannot turn a blind eye to this process of delegitimization, because it's not just about being loved by the international community. This is nice to have, but this is not that important. But because today, when it comes to decision making, we have other leaders that they need to address their own public opinion. And I could hear more than once, during the second war in Lebanon and during the operation in Gaza Strip, leaders calling me saying, we know that you are right. We know that Hamas need to be addressed militarily. We know that Hezbollah attacked Israel and it was unprovoked attack. But help us to give an answer to the press, whether it's the BBC or others, and to give an answer to our own public opinion. So it's not only, this affects the legitimacy of Israel to act against terror. I mean, it's not even just the arrest warrants against Israeli officials, not even me. I don't take it personally. And basically my parents, since you mentioned my parents, they served their time in the British prison. I'm willing to do so. Maybe this is part of an ongoing fight for the existence of the State of Israel, but this is not the real issue. The real issue, or the example for this real issue, was the flotilla event. A small military operation. It is true that 9 civilians died. But when we compare this to the situation in the world, to the fight of the free world against terror in different parts of the world, I think that the reaction of the world could have been completely different when the background was different. Could have been different. And this is something that we need to understand. It's not just nice to have. It's something that we need, because the existence of Israel is not just our military force, but also the legitimacy to use it. And this is the reason that we need to act together in order to regain legitimacy. And this is something that needs to be addressed together. Now, talking about this basic Jewish Israeli frustration. They don't understand us. Well, there are those saying, okay, the world is against us. Let's sit together in the corner, hoping that this is going to change. We can be united against these threats. I believe that this is not the right answer. And I believe that the only way to explain to the world what Israel is not just good asbara. It's not just nice talking heads on television when needed. It's about a better understanding what Israel is. And we need to define a new vision for Zionism, because I believe that Zionism didn't die when the state of Israel was born. And when we are talking and asking others to say Israel is a Jewish state, what is a Jewish state? I mean, we are talking in terms of Jewish and democratic state, and everybody knows what is a democracy, because all these young people here in Israel, I just met yesterday some of the Israeli IDF soldiers, and they know what is a democracy. They see all these American movies and sitcoms. They can quote the American constitution. Israel doesn't have a constitution. So they know what is a democracy, but what is a Jewish state? Is a Jewish state is a monopoly of the ultra-Orthodox parties on the Jewishness of the state? Is this a religious state? I don't think so. Is this a state that the minorities doesn't have equal rights as citizens? I don't think so. But when we look at Israel, we see different communities living side by side in the same tiny, embarrassingly tiny place without real common vision. For some, it's a religious state, halakha state. The Supreme Court is not the source of legitimacy, but the Torah. And for others, and this is something that we need to understand, in Israel we see now two different poles. On one hand we see the ultra-Orthodox, and on the other we see the Israelis, the Tzabar, which was the creation of Israel. But when I ask Israelis, young people, teenagers, what does it mean to you, for you to be a Jew? Or when I related this to this question when I was Minister of Immigrant Absorption, and we needed I think that we need to do it now to ease the process of conversion in Israel in order to make it possible for those who want to be part of the Jewish people here in Israel, those who entered Israel and become Israeli citizens according to the law of return, but they cannot be part of the Jewish people because of all of the problems that they face here. But the answer that I got from some of the Israelis, they say, what do you care? They're going to be Jews, they're going to Israeli schools, they're going to speak in Hebrew, they serve in the army. Is this the meaning of Judaism today, to serve in the army, to speak Hebrew? And if this is the meaning of Judaism, there is no common denominator between Israel and the Jews in diaspora.